Welcome to the second video in our series on Mimesis, which is a very famous book written by the critic Erich Auerbach. And in this book, he's talking about this concept of mimesis, and mimesis means imitation, and in this case, what Auerbach is talking about is the imitation of reality. So how is reality depicted in fiction? And in chapter 1, which is what we'll talk about here, he compares two different fictional accounts of reality. The one is from book 19 of the Odyssey, and the other passage is Genesis 22 from the Old Testament. That may seem a kind of odd comparison, and it certainly is in some ways, but in the second half of this video we'll talk about why he does this and what is at stake. First, however, let's just talk briefly about the kind of comparison he makes here and how these two texts are different in their conception of mimesis. We'll start here with a passage from the Odyssey, and this is from book 19 of the Odyssey. At this point, Odysseus has come home to Ithaca. He is in disguise, and he doesn't want to reveal his identity, but he's worried because his old nurse, Eurycleia, is going to wash his feet, and he has a scar that she may be able to recognize. So that's kind of what's going on here. Now let's read this particular passage, which is where we start to get into the memory of where the scar came from. And we read here, "So she drew near," this is the nurse, "and began to wash her lord, and straightway knew the scar of the wound which long ago a boar had dealt him with his white tusk when Odysseus had gone to Parnassus to visit Autolycus." That's his grandfather. Now notice what happens in the next little bit. It moves very smoothly into this memory of the scar. So there's a memory of the scar, and this is an event that takes place further back in time, of course, but the memory is so smoothly integrated into the text that we move from one story into the next without really any transition. It's not like Odysseus thinks to himself, oh, this is what happens. No, the narrator simply tells us all about it. Okay, well, that's the passage. Now let's make some observations, or at least let's follow the observations that Auerbach makes about this. And after that, we'll talk about the Old Testament passage. The first thing to note in this passage is that everything is visible. Okay, and this is kind of a broad concept, but what Auerbach means by this is that, first of all, the scar is visible, so everything is externalized, and then also the memory itself becomes visible in a sense. It's not as if this is part of the psychology of the text of Odysseus' memory. It's rather simply a story that can be externalized and made visible, and nothing is really hidden here. There's no real mystery. There's not even really much suspense. So no suspense, according to Auerbach. This is a very problematic claim to make, this notion that, in fact, much of classical epic, or at least Homer's epic, lacks suspense. The narrator, according to Auerbach, has no trouble digressing, and the digressions relax the tension. So instead of upping the tension, there is no suspense, and we simply see everything visibly on the surface without actually worrying about some kind of background, some kind of mystery. There's nothing like that. What we can also say then is that the psychology of the text, the psychology is downplayed. We don't really get to see inside the mind of Odysseus very much. And Auerbach has this great line where he talks about how in a Homeric epic, the hero wakes up every morning as if it's the first day of his life. There is no real character development that way. A character is, characterized by these kinds of external qualities. And this is where things like epithets are really important. An epithet is a little tag, right, that characterizes who you are. You might call an epithet a kind of nickname. So we call Zeus the Cloud Gatherer, for instance. Odysseus is always wily Odysseus. Even Autolycus in the passage above had some kind of description. He's known for his thievery, and you can see that Odysseus has a lot in common with him. Okay, another thing we can say here is that everything is on one plane. Okay, so we have just one plane of reality or representation, and we can see that in the way these two passages, the present moment and the past moment, they're just put side by side, right? And then we go back to the present, and there's no foregrounding or backgrounding. It's simply all on one plane of existence. Incidentally, we can also compare this with a law of epic that has a particular name. We call this Zielinski's law. Again, it's a bit of a disputed law, but Zielinski's law is somewhat similar in that, according to Zielinski's law, when you read a Homeric epic, no two actions can occur simultaneously. So, for instance, when people are throwing spears at each other, right, I'll just draw a little arrow here, we're not going to see two spears crossing in the air. Instead, one person throws a spear, if you read the Iliad, and then it either hits with an effect or it misses and somebody throws the spear back. Whatever the case, we're not going to see two things happening simultaneously. All right, so the final way in which everything happens on one plane then is in relation to social class. And the idea here is that most of the characters in a Homeric epic belong to the aristocratic classes, and as a result, there's not the same kind of full spectrum in terms of the way in which human behavior is captured. And that presents for Auerbach at least a limited form of mimesis, because if you're only copying part of reality, then you're limiting your vision, so to speak. Okay, that gives us a sense of the kind of mimesis we might find in Homer. Let's turn next to the Old Testament and to the story of Abraham and Isaac. In this story, just to give you a very quick recap, we have Abraham who's going to sacrifice his son Isaac, which is what God asks him to do. But at the very last moment, an angel intervenes, and when Abraham looks up, he sees a ram in the thicket, and he's able to sacrifice that instead. Now, this story, according to Auerbach, is a total contrast to Homer. Here, for one thing, we have an immense amount of mystery. We don't really know exactly why God is asking Abraham to do this, other than to test him. We don't know what goes through Abraham's mind. There are details of the plot that are kind of sketchy. So, for instance, we don't have an exact place. It says it's in the land of Moriah, but that's about all we have. Abraham, as Auerbach points out, travels for 3 days through some kind of vacuum. We don't really know what the setting is for his travels. So, in the Old Testament, then, in these stories, we lack a certain level of detail. We don't have that sense of motivation, but at the same time, we do have some kind of complex psychology. So it's precisely because we can't tell exactly what's going on that we can kind of imagine that Abraham must have had doubts. He must have thought, why am I doing this? Why is God asking me to do this? And of course, if you read something like Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling, a great book from the 19th century, you see this incredible focus on the possible doubts and fears and questions that Abraham might have had. So Kierkegaard was able to write an entire book about the psychology of just this one chapter in the Bible. The other thing that we have here is we do have a foreground and a background. Okay, a foreground plus a background. Abraham is in the foreground and God is, so to speak, in the background. And we have this difference then between Abraham being human and God being so remote, being so powerful. Whereas in Homer, the gods are basically a different version of people. They're very similar. They have the same qualities. They speak the same way. They're just more powerful. So in the Old Testament, we have much more of a contrast then. And that creates more of a sense of scope, which is really what Auerbach is trying to say, that when you compare these texts, The mimesis in the one is very focused on one kind of small piece of reality, whereas with the Old Testament, it's much bigger. And according to Auerbach, that creates more of a sense of the sublime, this spine-tingling feeling of reading something powerful and amazing. And that also has to do with the kind of heroes that we have. Here we don't have heroes who always wake up, the same way as they were yesterday. We have heroes who have ups and downs, right? We have heroes like Adam, for instance, who falls as far down as you can before he gets the promise that, maybe in the future Christ will come and restore things. So you have heroes like that, like David, who sins with Bathsheba, who fall from greatness all the way to the lowest pits of despair before they try to pick themselves up again, and they can only do it with God's help. For Auerbach, this is both epic and tragic. Okay, epic and tragic. And I want to emphasize these terms, sublime, epic, tragic, because what Auerbach is doing is he's saying, well, all of these terms have traditionally been applied to Greek texts, Hellenic texts, Roman texts, right? All the classical literature, but we should apply them also to the Old Testament, which is often neglected in terms of its literary and, in this case, mimetic qualities. So what we have here then is we have way more suspense. We have plenty of suspense. And you can see that when you look at all these terms, which are traditionally applied to classical texts, they're being shifted now to a new domain. The last thing we'll mention here about the Old Testament is that there's also some kind of historical purpose, which seems to be missing in Homer. With Homer, it's very clearly a fictional story. But within this kind of context, the story of Abraham and Isaac doesn't make much sense unless you have this larger feeling that it's part of a historical narrative. The promises are given to Abraham that his seed, his offspring, is going to be rich and plentiful, and a Messiah is going to come. All of these larger pieces that are part of the context, they define the story, and we can't really read it without having that sense of historical purpose. So, as you can see from this, he actually seems to prefer the Old Testament to Homer. He prefers the Old Testament, despite its perhaps some of its weaknesses in terms of being dramatic. He turns that around and makes these qualities sublime and astonishing and something to really admire about the person or the people who wrote the Old Testament. All right, so to sum up then, what Auerbach is saying is that Homer gives us essentially a kind of look at reality that's entirely fictional. And because everything is visible, Homer, according to Auerbach, Homer doesn't teach us anything. He doesn't require interpretation. Everything is on the surface, and as a result, you don't really need to interpret him. You can only enjoy him. He ensnares us with a fictional kind of reality. Homer's traditionally seen as the great liar because of his fiction, but there's no real historical truth to it that absolutely matters. So that is Homer. Then by contrast, according to Auerbach, when we think about the Old Testament makes what he calls a tyrannical claim that it is actually historical truth. Which is not to say that Auerbach actually believes that all of the Old Testament is historically true. He says some elements are legendary. Okay, there are some legendary parts, like the story of David and Goliath, let's say. He doesn't feel that that's probably historically true. But at the same time, the narrative is so powerful because it really wants to be taken as truthful. And this idea of the tyrannical claim, I think, is interesting because in a moment we'll also talk about the historical context when Auerbach is writing the book and he's thinking about the Nazis. And so he actually juxtaposes the kind of bad rule of Hitler with a different tyrannical claim, which has much more force and is ultimately more powerful. So keep that in mind, because the language is actually very interesting here. The Old Testament then, compared to Homer, does require interpretation. We have to interpret the text because otherwise it doesn't make much sense. So we need to interpret the text. And one way in which we could do this, for instance, is the way Christian theologians often interpreted the text, which is through what's called typological criticism. So typological criticism, which is actually something that Auerbach himself practices throughout the book. With typological criticism, we have Old Testament figures and Old Testament stories which become types or kind of foreshadowing of New Testament realities. And an example would be something like in the story of Abraham and Isaac, the ram, which is sacrificed in place of Isaac, might become later Christ, right? Because Christ is the substitutionary sacrifice for the sins of mankind. So what you can see there then is that typological criticism allows us to provide an interpretation that makes some sense of the mysteries of the text. And that added layer really suggests the importance of this text. It needs interpretation, it's extremely profound, and it is very sublime. All right, so the last thing I want to do then is talk a little bit about what is at stake here. So what is at stake in all of this? Why should we care about this argument? And we're going to point out a bunch of different things here. So the first thing is this question of mimesis. Okay, what is reality? What is reality? How do we depict it? How can we access it? And which version of reality in these two texts is better? So there's obviously a lot of big questions there. And Auerbach seems to prefer the Old Testament version over the version that Homer gives us. The second thing here has to do with some kind of theory of history that's behind the text. So what kind of theory of history do we prefer? And if we think about the way in which a lot of Germans at the time were thinking about history, they saw some kind of evolutionary progress in history. So if we think, for instance, of the Old Testament, they might have seen this as barbaric, and they may have juxtaposed it with, let's say, Hellenic culture, so Greek culture, right? So we have Hellenic culture, which is slightly better. And then we have the New Testament, which they saw as maybe better than the Old Testament. And then all of this together leads to modernity, contemporary reality. And so if we chart a kind of line of progress, we can feel that maybe the Old Testament is at the bottom end, and we're going to go upwards and onwards. From that perspective, then, the Old Testament might be seen as barbaric. In fact, there were Christian theologians and Christian authors who did want to say that the Old Testament was inferior to the New Testament. And some scholars have pointed out that even some Lutheran theologians who were sympathetic towards the Nazis, which of course wasn't all of them, felt that the Old Testament had to be dismissed. And they talked about a kind of this idea of taking the Jewishness out of the text. The term they used for this was Entjudung. So Entjudung. All right, so making it less Jewish, as if being Jewish was a bad thing. Okay, obviously Auerbach is trying to fight this idea of, this false progress in history by taking the Old Testament and putting it above all these other forms of culture and saying, well, this is sublime, this is powerful, this is where you see real heroism in these stories of people who are actually fairly ordinary and sometimes suffer a great deal. And I think he sees a lot of his own suffering being in exile in these characters. In the third place, how does all of this then relate to the Nazis? We've mentioned them a few times, and I think there are some interesting connections. I'd like to just read a short passage from the text, and I think by reading this you're going to see how Auerbach himself ties all of these concerns to contemporary events. So he writes at one point, "Let the reader think of the history which we are ourselves witnessing. Anyone who, for example, evaluates the behavior of individual men and groups of men at the time of the rise of National Socialism in Germany," he's thinking about the 1930s here, "or the behavior of individual peoples and states before and during the last war," right, World War II, "will feel how difficult it is to represent historical themes in general, and how unfit they are for legend." And a little bit further, "The motives of all the interested parties are so complex that the slogans of propaganda can be composed only through the crudest simplification, with the result that friend and foe alike can often employ the same ones. To write history is so difficult that most historians are forced to make concessions to the technique of legend." What he's saying, in other words, is that when it comes to the propaganda of the Nazis, it's actually remarkably similar to the kind of lies that Homer is telling. This is a simplified version of reality. This is not what reality really is, where people truly suffer, where ordinary people exist, and where we don't just have the higher classes. And he's saying that ultimately we need some better version of history that's closer to reality. So if you actually compare some of the terms that he uses, it creates a really interesting contrast here between the kind of terms he associates with Homer and the kind of terms that he ultimately associates with the Old Testament. Now, I'm simplifying a little bit here by putting these terms next to each other, but I hope that you can see how interesting this contrast actually is, that there's much more at stake than just this notion that the Old Testament has a different form of mimesis. Another related point here is that if you look, for instance, at the sculpture that was popular with the Nazis, with Hitler, let's say, and I have an example here from the sculptor Arno Breker, who is still popular with neo-Nazis, but that's a different story. If you look at this kind of sculpture, you can see how it tries to use Greek forms and the celebration of the body and the external and the sensuousness, right, that comes with that. And it tries to use this kind of external glorification of some kind of heroic ideal as a form of mimesis in order to inspire people and to unify or give a sense of national identity. So that's the kind of thing that Auerbach is up against. That's what he hates. And that's why he's trying to suggest that the Old Testament presents something very different, much more real and much more powerful. Okay, so let's finish then with some final reflections here, final reflections about the text and what you might take away from all of this. The first thing is this question of whether we should read the text autobiographically. Okay, so does autobiography matter? So far I've done a lot with saying that Auerbach's own plight at the hands of the Nazis, his own exile, we can see this in the text and we shouldn't ignore it. It really affects the way in which he reads the past. So that is a broader question. Should we read the text autobiographically? Another thing to think about is whether Auerbach's approach, where he always looks at one passage and then kind of weaves this larger story around it, whether this approach is justified. Okay? Do you like this way of doing literary theory? One little passage in book 19 of Homer's Odyssey, is that enough to really base this entire theory of Greek culture on? One chapter in the Old Testament, is that enough to say so much about Judaic culture? Some interesting questions there. Beyond this, we can also think about the question of essentialism. So, because he does so much with one passage, is he perhaps guilty of essentialism? That he basically says, well, we can define the entire culture, the entire essence of a culture in a few brief words. And if we think then about Judaic culture, is he maybe guilty of Orientalism? Orientalism, which is this notion that you create a kind of mythical notion of the Orient, of Eastern culture. It's very tempting, for instance, to say that Greek culture is rational and everything is focused on the external, on the visible, and then Oriental culture becomes mysterious and exotic and all of these other kinds of things. That's definitely a danger here. And then the final thought to take away from all of this is to think a little bit about this notion of the scar. And I find this really fascinating because what Auerbach has basically done is he suggested that each little passage is itself a scar. Every passage is a scar that reveals the wounds of the culture, you might say. So if you look at each scar, you're going to see this whole story that's behind it. And you can think of the scar as like a synecdoche. So a synecdoche that stands in for the entire culture. But if the scar is ultimately associated with Odysseus, right, with the story of Odysseus, which he doesn't like as much, and yet this is his own way of interpreting the text, where through one passage everything has light shed upon it, everything becomes clear, there are no mysteries anymore, is he actually closer to the Homeric approach to life in his own literary criticism? I think that is probably the most fascinating question of all, and maybe that's a good one to leave you with.